Okay, today we're going to be looking at the Reagan administration, and I want to tell you my sources. We're getting to the point in history where it is so recent that historians really don't have consensus about what the takeaway messages are from that administration. So I'd say the Reagan administration, the jury's still out really on what is important to teach about the Reagan administration. So I want to tell you my sources. My sources are the state-adopted textbook for this is the Americans by McDougall-Littell. I'm leaning on them pretty hard for the organization and subject matter of this mini lecture because this is the way they have presented and organized the information in the textbook. We don't all have access to a textbook. We don't have enough textbooks to give you, so I'm going to summarize the information they provide in that. So Reagan, he's president from 1980 to 1988. He was a really iconic figure in America and really important. I'll say this in general. Whatever you say about Ronald Reagan, the nation was really kind of down coming out of the 70s. We'd had lost Vietnam, we'd had race riots, we'd had all kinds of issues and problems. We'd had the president resign. Everybody was really pretty pessimistic in the 1970s. And Reagan was able to kind of, like FDR, it's interesting because they're from different parties, but Reagan really was inspired by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he kind of turned the tone of the nation to a much more optimistic and positive point of view. He was a really good-natured man's man. He had been a World War II, during World War II, he had been a movie actor who always played like the good heroic character. He'd gone on to be the governor of California. And he was just, seemed really comfortable in his skin. He was an actor. He could play a role. He seemed to know what people wanted and was able to deliver those lines or those that body language that people were looking for affirmation. He's also an excellent communicator. He spoke simply, directly. He had memorable lines that he could effectively communicate. And so people really loved watching his speeches and hearing him frame whatever subject he was talking about. Also, early on in his administration, there was an assassination attempt on his life, and he was shot by John Hinckley Jr. John Hinckley Jr. had an obsession with Jodie Foster, the actress, and he wanted to show his commitment to her by attempting to assassinate or assassinating the president. The president got shot in the chest and recuperated. They pulled the bullets out, and he recuperated quite quickly. And he's the oldest president we've ever had elected, so some people were really worried. I think he was 72 when he was elected. And some people were worried about his health, and he was quite the comeback kid, and so a lot of people thought that he seemed almost heroic as a result of that. He had really typical Republican ideas that are kind of standard by now. He thought that the federal government should be smaller. He wanted to devolve power to the states. He wanted to lower taxes for everyone, and will bring about the largest tax cut across the board in American history. He also was a man who supported traditional Christian principles. So he was opposed to gay marriage, for example. He would like to bring prayer back in schools, those kinds of issues. And we had the rise in the early 80s of this group called the Moral Majority. They were fundamentalist Christians led by a guy named Jerry Falwell, who started this organization called the Moral Majority. Pat Robertson, the 700 Club, these are some of the media touch points that represent this group. And he had a lot of followers from the Moral Majority. My grandmothers, for example, were both fundamentalist Christians, and they received voter guides in the pews that told them to support Ronald Reagan, and they did. So fundamentalist Christians were a key constituent group of Reagan's. The first thing he did is he cut the budget. He wanted government to be smaller, and that means spending less money. However, he couldn't cut Medicare or Social Security because elderly people were a key supporter of him. So he mainly cut the budget by cutting business regulation. This is typical of Republican positions too. They tend to think that the free market should rule and that we shouldn't have too much business regulation. So he cut back on things like environmental regulations and other business regulations. And then he also cut back on programs for the poor. There was a growing sense in the 80s that some people were abusing anti-poverty programs. So for example, things like school lunch funds were cut. It's during this time period they started saying that ketchup was a vegetable and yogurt was a meat because it had protein in it. So by redefining certain food categories, they made lunches less expensive. Also, they quit, there was less regulation of nursing homes. They had deregulated the airlines, and so airline seats became a little more cramped, and you could put more people on a plane. those kinds of things. Also, environmental protections were cut, or they weren't as active in regulating the environment. He cut taxes across the board, 25%. And this is part of what he calls supply side or trickle-down economics. We've talked about this before, where you cut taxes, people spend their money, creates jobs, and therefore work is rewarded. However, trickle-down economics works out well, and they call this Reaganomics during this time period. It sounds really good in theory, but it doesn't work out so good in principle, and we'll talk about why. But he did cut taxes on the wealthy and across the board as well. But since the wealthy were paying the majority of the taxes, they yielded much greater benefit from the tax cuts. So that's just what I've just presented here is the theory behind Reaganomics or trickle-down economics. The problem during Reagan's administration is he didn't cut spending enough, and so we get a huge debt. And this is where the modern debt problem is, I'd say, starts and continues from the presidents from Reagan to the present. They have all spent more than the country's been bringing in. We really haven't been willing for the last 30 years in America, been willing to tax ourselves to pay for the degree of government we seem to have. Okay, so he increased our debt more than all the presidents before him combined, and every president since him has had similar increases in the budget, with the exception of Bill Clinton, is the only president that actually started paying back the debt and had no deficit. So this graphic here will show you the deal with the debt in the past was that we had what was called temporary debt. You can see that we went into debt during World War II, for example, and that would make sense because we were fighting a war. But very quickly after the war, we began paying back that debt and paying down our debt through pretty aggressive taxation. Then in 1980, you see that Reagan's elected. And what we have after that is what's called structural debt, where we just want a bigger government than we're willing to pay for. There's no like specific thing that happened in that time period to lead to debt, like an event like World War II. We just aren't taxing ourselves to pay for the government we have, is the problem. Okay. This tells you a little bit about the current debt. In 2011, I found this graphic that this was the debt we had, and this is which president was responsible for that total amount of debt. The total amount of debt back then was $14.3 trillion, which is a mind-blowing amount of money. Today, it's up around $17 trillion. So the total amount of debt has only increased, even with the short period of time where Bill Clinton was paying back the debt. The national debt clock is something you can look up. It's always running and tells you what the total debt is, and it's about $17 trillion now. So in class, be happy. Let's talk more about what our options are in terms of paying back the debt or not paying back the debt, and who we owe the money to. But that's a longer conversation than I can have here on camera by myself. He also did increase spending, and he increased spending on defense. He came up with this really kind of wacky idea that he hadn't really talked to anyone about. It was called Star Wars, commonly known, or called the Strategic Defense Initiative. He basically said we should develop satellite-based, space-based projects that will allow us to identify nuclear weapons that are headed to the United States and shoot them out of the sky before they hit us. Really cool idea. Almost impossible to do scientifically. It's kind of like hitting a bullet with another bullet when you don't know where the gun is being shot from or when. It's quite a physics problem. A lot of scientists were kind of looking at each other like, who's working on this? We've never heard of it before, even though the president showed really cool graphics in his speeches about it. The bottom line is, whether it works or not, doesn't really matter. It scared the bejesus out of the Soviets. They thought the president wouldn't be talking about it unless we could do it, and therefore they thought we could do it. They knew immediately that their economy under communism was not nearly productive enough to actually pull this off and compete with it. So it led the Soviets to kind of decide to start negotiating with us and try and reform their economy to make it more productive. This inevitably led to market reforms in their economy, which are going to lead to the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the fall of communism in the Soviet Union. So a lot of people credit Reagan with ending communism or winning the Cold War. While it certainly did begin unraveling quickly on his watch, most people think that it was actually the contributions of all the presidents after World War II, kind of sticking with the containment concept. But Reagan definitely, through his Star Wars, it was a wacky idea that worked to bring the Soviets to make changes that led to their dissolution. Reagan was able to appoint 3 justices to the Supreme Court. These are their names. The most important one is Sandra Day O'Connor, simply because she's the first female that was ever appointed to the Supreme Court. But the court continues to take a more conservative tone under Reagan. He at first was really hard. When he first came to the presidency, he was extremely hard on the Soviets. He called them the evil empire. And he kind of agreed with Teddy Roosevelt that the way to intimidate or keep everybody honest was to be a very strong country in terms of our national security. In time, he met Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, and they actually got along really well in terms of just a organic kind of friendship that developed between them. He supported the Soviet Union in trying to reform their government and their economy. The cultural kind of governmental easing of restrictions on the people was called glasnost. And the economic reforms they tried in the Soviet Union that moved them towards market economy were called perestroika, sorry. And the combination of those things also led the Soviets to sign a treaty with us called the INF Treaty. This was kind of like built on what Nixon had done during the détente days of the 1970s. It said that we would both limit our nuclear weapons. But there's a new element to it. It said that we would inspect each other's countries to make sure we weren't lying. And this is a new approach in diplomacy, which is trust but verify. That was a famous phrase of Reagan's. That, hey, we trust the Soviet Union to do what they say they're going to do, but just to be sure, let's verify and go look in everybody's closets and under their beds and make sure they're not lying about how many nuclear weapons they actually have. So that is a new angle to international agreements. He also was really paranoid about communism coming to Central and South America, particularly in Nicaragua, which is pictured here on the PowerPoint. There had been a group called the Sandinistas, which seemed to be wanting to bring more communistic or socialistic policies to Nicaragua. And he doesn't like that. So he wants to stop communism in Nicaragua, and he is against the Sandinistas. And he wants the CIA and Congress to fund a group called the Contras who are going to fight against communism in Nicaragua. Congress is not convinced that this is that big of a deal, and they don't want to put the money in it. Plus, the Contras kind of have a shady reputation in terms of their tactics in Nicaragua. So Congress says, no, we're not going to fund that, and they pass this amendment saying that, called the Boland Amendment. The Reagan administration does not accept this, and this is where the problems start. The Reagan administration, whether Reagan knew about it or not, that is not clear. However, with his knowledge or not, they started secretly selling weapons to our enemy, Iran. They knew that Iran would keep it quiet, and because Iran really wanted the weapons to fight Iraq. And so we were going to sell them weapons. That was going to give us some secret money. And with that secret money, we were going to funnel money to the Contras in Nicaragua behind Congress's back. This is a huge deal. It's called the IranContra affair. And it's patently unconstitutional, and it should have led to impeachment, but it did not, because the president was such a likable guy, and the issue was so confusing, and most Americans didn't really have the tolerance for this rather boring set of circumstances. So he's called the Teflon president, seems to be able to just shake that affair right off of his back. And when his vice president becomes president, he pardons everyone who was associated with the IranContra affair. In 1984, he's reelected by a landslide, and he wins against Walter Mondale. The only thing you need to know about that election is that Walter Mondale had the first female vice presidential candidate, and her name was Geraldine Ferraro. She just passed away in 2012, but she was the first female ever on a major presidential ticket. All right, so I've got about a minute left, and so I don't really have time to tell you about George H.W. Bush. I'll do that on a separate video that is next. But George H.W. Bush was the vice president for Reagan and is the first vice president since 1836 to be elected to the presidency. And like Martin Van Buren, things are not going to go so swimmingly for him because of some of the challenges that Reagan is going to leave for him. Okay, so I'll sign off here, and we'll talk more about that next time. All right, see you.